Hello, everyone. It is 10 o'clock in California Pacific time, and it is time to start our first webinar for the 2021 webinar season. I'm Jill Escher. I am president of the National Council on Severe Autism, and I can ask our panelists today to show their faces. You can turn on your videos, and I can do a quick introduction for the video and also the format that we're going to be using today in the webinar, sorry. Today's webinar is called What's Wrong with Facilitated Communication? Facilitated communication is a topic that raises many questions for parents and educators who are developing communication programs for their children with autism who exhibit complex communication needs. Our guest speakers today are Dr. Howard Shane, Dr. James Todd, Dr. Ralf Schlosser, and Janyce Boynton, and I will provide more detailed introductions before each of them speak. A little note about the format today. If you have questions, you will see there is a Q&A option. You just have to type in the question, and then after each speaker, as time permits, I will pitch them questions relevant to their presentation. And then we are reserving time at the end for a more panel type of discussion, with other questions that may come in. Okay, so without further ado, I think that we are going to just hop right into things. We gave ourselves a lot of time today, fortunately. Hopefully we can have a very productive discussion. I'm going to start off by introducing Dr. James Todd. Dr. Todd is professor of psychology at Eastern Michigan University. He has served as psychology department head and associate dean of arts and sciences, also at EMU. He has a Ph.D. in developmental and child psychology and a master's in human development from University of Kansas, where he also earned bachelor's degrees in psychology and human development. Dr. Todd has served as an expert witness and consultant in several court cases involving false allegations of abuse, authored by users of FC or RPM. All right, so I'm going to turn it over to you. He will provide an overview, a little bit of historical background. Go ahead, you can unmute yourself.
Okay.
Oh, sorry. Try again. My bad. There you go. Sorry, my bad.
I'm looking over at my second screen. There, I can look now. I can see all you folks. Okay, I'm Professor Todd. I'm going to do a little bit of historical introduction to facilitated communication, and other issues, related issues, and I'm going to share my screen here, or attempt. So we're going to try to make this work, and I'm going to share a portion of the screen. There we go. Does everybody see the portion of my screen? Or does everybody see me, a little bit of me and a slide there? Is that what's going on?
You are all good. You're good.
Okay, cool. Well, I'm going to do a little selective history of facilitated communication and its relatives. And depending on how you've contacted facilitated communication, you're probably going to find this brief 5-minute history wanting in missing one element or another of the story. So this is just the most general overview of sort of where it came from and sort of what happened and some elements in the middle. Obviously, we've got a 30-some year history, 40-some year history of this to cover. So let's first start. And this facilitated communication really started in the 1980s in Australia, maybe a little bit earlier, even though there were a few independent discoveries of the same sort of procedure. And it was initially discovered by Rosemary Crossley, who now runs the Anne McDonald Center, which was the Deal Center for a long time before its name changed. And it became a big deal in Australia. And if there's Australians, they can eventually chime in or ask a question. And there was a book that came out, Annie's Coming Out, that eventually even became a movie. So this was a big deal. This young woman whose lack of speech was remediated by the virtue of this facilitated communication. Rosemary Crossley supposedly holding and the hand or arm and preventing the impulsive movements, thereby facilitated communication was born. It was actually born with a number of intervening steps involving a variety of techniques until it became the kind of hand-holding, arm-holding physical intervention that we see today. And there's a copy of Annie's Coming Out. Though that's with is so co-authored, it says, by Anne McDonald. There were a number of court cases. By the time facilitated communication got to the United States, there'd already been false allegation cases, and even a case in the court in Australia involving Anne McDonald, who was it had to do with rights for the book. And one of the interesting things about that was the incredibly low standards that people apply to facilitated communication proof. After about 3 days of trying, they finally got a couple of correctly spelled words, which to me would have been incontrovertible proof that the thing didn't work, but the master of the court back there accepted that as a demonstration of valid communication. So literally days of attempts, and then finally a little tiny bit of what appeared to be a genuine thing, but obviously it could have been a coincidence. Let me go back. And of course, the United States, the real thing that happened with facilitated communication was Douglas Bicklin of Syracuse University. There's his page, or part of his page, from the university site there at Syracuse. He's retired now. He was the dean of the College of Education and a bunch of things for a while. He now this is I got some fancy stuff here, so prepare yourself. He went from Syracuse. There we go. There we go. I hope the animation worked. I hope you're all excited about that. He went to Australia and visited Rosemary Crossley and saw this facilitated communication stuff happening, and he was very impressed. Now, he wasn't a psychologist. He was a sociologist, and he was unprepared to sort of critically evaluate what he saw. So what he did was get excited about it and then bring it back to Syracuse, where he then started folks doing it in various ways. There were some intervening steps. I understand that he gave some presentations on it in other places before he ultimately ended up publishing an account of this in Harvard Educational Review, where he outlined all of the kinds of things that he had seen in these great awakenings, and virtually everybody who the facilitation was done on supposedly was now speaking at some level of sophisticated verbal expression through typing or pointing in various ways. And it was, if you read this article, it's a model of lack of critical analysis. There's no attempt to evaluate the validity of this stuff in any sort of even simple empirical way. And it was in the Harvard Educational Review, which I think is a sort of dark day in their time, because it was such an error to publish something with such grandiose claims with so little evidence of validity, and easily acquired evidence of validity. Now we're spinning around because just the whole thing became dizzying. I don't have time to present the literally hundreds of articles, an explosion of interest in this thing. Remember, this is the early 90s. And there's no internet. This is all by mail, telephone, word of mouth. And I picked this one because the thing just got out of control. Here's Paul Haskew and Ann Donnellan writing a little book in 1993 about facilitated communication. She was they were at the University of Wisconsin-Madison at the time. And one of the claims in this book is that facilitated communication involves ESP. So that even became part of it, because occasionally, of course, the typing would include things the children couldn't possibly know. And so that was attributed to their extrasensory perception. And that's how far it spun. There were reports of kids as young as 2 writing poetry, that kind of thing. And for the most part, it was believed by the advocates. Now, we're going to talk about the advocates at the time, but we're talking themes and variations, and I'm going to try not to read these slides because I got 5 minutes and I hope I don't run over. Even though FC is supposedly to involve stabilizing and backward pressure to prevent impulsivity along with emotional support, it very quickly morphed into a lot of different forms. So when you think of facilitated communication as simply being hand holding or wrist holding, that's a much too narrow view. We saw within the first few years, letter boards being held in the air, rapid prompting style, people holding both the person's arm and the letter board, and other forms of two-handed facilitation by gestures, where it was clear that the individual typing was following, gestural cues or verbal cues from the facilitator, touches to the back arm and things like that, especially inexperienced facilitators. So characterizing it as hand holding or wrist holding is far too narrow. In fact, almost any form of interaction could end up being FC, as long as there was a facilitator there to provide some sort of cue for letter selection. And what we would usually see is a fading from explicit control to increasingly subtle control that very often the facilitator themselves did not see occurring. And one of the implications of this is the FC and rapid prompting advocates seem oblivious historically to how cueing and prompt dependency develop. In fact, I had a student look through their entire literature, or at least a sampling of their literature, and she found literally 0 references to the technical literature on prompt fading and cueing. So that's a problem for academics. Now let's keep going with problems. These problems are problems for facilitated communication. Of course, this is a fascinating thing, so people started studying it. And one of the things they found is the problem that if you kept the information from the facilitator, you wouldn't get the answers you wanted. And if you showed the facilitator something different from what the user saw, you would get what the facilitator saw. Of course, Ann Donnellan apparently attributed that to ESP, but that's an interesting way to rescue your facilitated communication, because that still means the authorship is not of the user, but the facilitator now sending psychic vibes. But anyway, there were a whole bunch of studies. By 1993, it was very clear that this stuff wasn't working. Literally 100% failure of the technique when the facilitator did not know the answer. And here's a study, one of the best ones by Doug Wheeler and other folks at the OD Heck School, where they had 180 chances for valid communication to be demonstrated and literally got 0 evidence of facilitated communication. And of course, in 1993, I skipped over it. In 1993, PBS Frontline put a documentary on in October, and it was repeated. That should have been the end of it. And we shouldn't be here. We should be out enjoying whatever it is other things we would be doing. But there were even more problems. Some states started in the 1990s, started adopting facilitated communication as official policy. Here's Pennsylvania in 1994. And here's Vermont about the same time, January 1994, with literally 0 evidence of effectiveness. Nobody had published a study showing it worked at all. And now we have literally states in the United States spending money adopting it as an official sort of policy. Let's go back. I keep pushing too many buttons here. I like the button pushing, I guess. And there were all kinds of books. I wish I had access to my office, because I have a shelf full of facilitated communication books. And then underneath that is yet again another shelf full of facilitated communication books, most of them published in the 90s. And this is one of the more interesting ones by Doug Bicklin and Donald Cardinal, Contested Words and Contested Science. I can assure you there's very little science in this book. This book is about science avoidance. Because if you apply, for example, the inductive principles of John Stuart Mill from the 1850s that are the foundation of all modern science, you will find this book dancing around all of that in order to supposedly prove facilitated communication by various indirect means. And of course, there were some supposedly confirmatory studies, and I'm running out of time, so I'm going to go through there quick. Here was one from 1992, which wasn't even a peer review study. It's a letter to the editor. But all of these studies have these amazing and interesting fatal flaws, like this one failed to test the blinding properly, such that it's pretty clear that the stimulus leakage during the study was never properly assessed. And when the replications were done, they got very little. They put headphones on the facilitators, and they didn't realize that when you only have 4 answers, the little bit of sonic leakage can indicate the answer. Here's one by Carol Vasquez that is very often cited as confirmatory now. One of the interesting things about it, it has had 2 subjects, one of whom couldn't do the stuff, the other of whom could actually type and speak on her own. So the question is, why is she in a facilitated communication study? In fact, some of the answers that are supposedly facilitated in this study actually came from her just typing on her own. This one, Weiss, Wagner, and Bauman, a 13-year-old middle school kid who supposedly got A's, could barely correctly answer 2nd grade level questions. And that was only after the facilitator started attending the test sessions. And they only reported the last 3 of an indeterminately long series of sessions. So they basically picked the best 3 and stopped. And even those weren't very good because you had to have the facilitator present to make it work. Don Cardinal, Hansen, and Wakeham, 3,800 trials. Out of those 3,800 trials, how many worked? 9.8%. Okay, there were over 11% correctly spelled wrong answers. Okay, that says facilitator guessing to me, and they gave the facilitators the answer list in advance. Okay, and Sheehan and Matuozzi, this is another one that's frequently cited as in the 1990s. All these are from 1996. In fact, the last 3 studies I've cited are all from the same journal in 1996. This one had the interesting feature of, if the blinded facilitator did not get the answer right, the experimenter could give hints and an unlimited number of tries. In one case, it took 61 tries to get the right answer. And when the facilitator finally typed the right answer, that was counted as evidence of FC. So that's the kind of thing that happened in the middle of the 90s. And of course, I've duplicated the slide so we get to see my little spinny effect yet again. And things keep going. In the 1990s, FC eventually fades from the media spotlight, but not from use. Major organizations pass resolutions against it. False accusation cases continue in the US and abroad. Most are resolved before they become real cases. So we don't hear, unless you're kind of in the business, you don't hear about many of them. The Facilitated Communication Institute was started at Syracuse in 1992 and continues to this day. They've changed the name, of course, to Supported Typing, and they've changed the name of the institute. Here we are in 2021. There is now still 0 methodologically sound controlled studies demonstrating FC to be effective. Literally nothing that could be called a properly controlled scientific studies. Ultimately, to this day, there's now dozens of studies, probably about 34, 35, most involving facilitator blinding, that show how and why FC fails. And of course, in 2000, the Facilitated Communication Training Standards are published. That's going to become important later in the second part of my presentation. These are not standards in any conventional sense. The 2000s, we start seeing these movies like 2005, Autism is a World. No attempt in this CNN documentary to validate the communication that was coming from the typing. And it's found out that the young woman who is featured in this is unable to do things like dial 911 on the phone, but is capable of FC. And we're going to talk a little bit about that later, unless I forget. More recently, Wretches and Jabberers, which became a fundraising thing. And there were books like this. I picked this book specifically because of its I don't know, unintentionally ironic title for a facilitated communication book, I Might Be You. And in this case, I think the experimental evidence says that, yes, indeed, the writer actually is somebody else. And then, of course, false accusation cases. This is the Wendrow case in 2007 that Howard and I worked on. And we can see Julian Wendrow reacting to his 70 days in solitary confinement due to the unfounded allegations against him. And here's in the 2000s, we, of course, get rapid prompting comes up. And here's a movie, HBO, A Mother's Courage, which started in Iceland as Sunshine Boy, but that didn't sell, so it became A Mother's Courage. And now, just very recently, yet again, another FC movie, The Reason I Jump. So basically, all the scientific work has maybe had some effect, but it still captures the popular imagination. Now, rapid prompting we have, this is the last minute, I think I've run over, but I don't have a clock. Rapid prompting is now being used in empirical studies, even though it has never been shown to work, even though the authors of those studies seem reticent to admit that they're using rapid prompting. A dozen, maybe more resolutions have come from major organizations repudiating or questioning FC in various ways. Rapid prompting is now spreading like FC did in the 90s, usually under other names now, like Spelling to Communicate. And FC advocates have adopted, as Mark Mostert predicted, the position that FC simply works and that validation is unnecessary. Despite all of the studies, the politics of FC is that it works, don't question it, we're going to move on and use it. And RPM advocates, I've gone to RPM workshops, multiple workshops, and they don't even address validation. They even sidestep it. The FC people at least talk about it. And to their credit, back in the early 1990s, they would participate in studies. The RPM people won't even consider that except to attack those who ask for validation. So that's the end of my little segment here. So I should turn it back. I don't know if I went too long. I think I did, but hopefully
That's okay.
I will then abbreviate the next one.
Don't worry about it. We have a whole bunch of questions. I can't ask all of them, but I'll ask a few. You mentioned that Douglas Bicklin was a sociologist. I have searched for his credentials over the years, and I think I remember finding that he had an EDD. I was wondering where you found his sociology background and was also wondering whether he had an EDD. Now all that shows up is a PhD. Thank you.
I don't know his exact degree. My understanding was that it was in some area of sociology. I've even looked at his dissertation, and there's an interesting article about that by Brian Gorman, I believe, where we find out that Bicklin, for example, sort of deceived his way into his dissertation site after initially being denied access by asking different people, and he wrote about that. And but don't take my word for it, read Brian Gorman's article. But Bicklin came to this not as a psychologist, and I think that's important. And I think the reason it's important is he was unable to recognize the degree and subtlety of stimulus control that can very often develop in these kinds of situations.
Great. Okay, many more. I'll just a few more before we go to our next speaker. Can you, because I think this is important, not all of our attendees will know what RPM is. Can you just give a quickie?
Rapid prompting method. It's basically a version of, it's presented as a type of teaching where you have these teach, ask trials. Okay, where you present some information and then you give the person a set of options to select from, and then they point to the options. And then over the course of time, the options turn into letters and the answers are spelled out. And eventually the letter board gets held in the air and moved around. And in my view, that's where the cueing comes from, is the movement of the letter board that becomes increasingly subtle.
All right, thank you. I wonder why journalists fear covering this scam. I long for a, quote, mystery shopper type approach. I'm in the UK and really tried to get a well-known reporter involved, but they are in fear of looking anti-disability. How can we change that?
Is that for me?
That's for you.
I've actually talked to journalists about that, and they basically tell us that that the editors don't want feel bad stories. They want feel good stories. And, these downer type stories where you go in and reveal that this really cool thing doesn't work, it does not appeal to a lot of it doesn't create readership, the expose kind of thing that you sometimes find in a Wired or some kind of magazine like that. But basically, you know, that's what they've told me. And it's for the editors, it's just not a saleable thing. They've got to have an interest. I mean, they've got to create an interesting magazine or newspaper. That's certainly true. And but it's a difficult thing to do. It's probably difficult to navigate.
Great. And let's just do one more. I wish I could ask them all. But I think this one will come up probably repeatedly today. How can we properly test if FC, RPM are scientifically valid?
Well, that's fairly easy. The tests that are done aren't controversial or unusual. They are fundamental to how science works, and they literally predate science. Basically, if you want to find out whether something is controlling something, you take it away and you put it back in. And that's John Stuart Mill's method of addition and subtraction that he formalized in the 1850s, that, as I said, has become the foundation of inductive inference in science. And basically, if here's the person typing and you think the facilitator is the source, you take away the facilitator as the source, in this case, take away their information about the answers disappear. You then free them up to know the answers, and all of a sudden the answers are there. And then you can expand it like Howard Shane has done and others, where you give the facilitator and the user different information and see what comes out. And what you get is either nothing, because sometimes I think the facilitators become nervous when the thing falls apart, or you get what the facilitator has seen, not what the user has seen. And I think that Janyce can speak to that because she was part of those kinds of studies.
Great. Well, thank you. I know we're going to come back to you later in this webinar, but for now, we are going to ask Dr. Howard Shane to please unmute himself and show his video. There he is. All right, and you can share your screen as well. All right, while he's doing that, Dr. Shane is the director of the Autism Language Program in the Department of Otolaryngology, Otolaryngology and Communication Enhancement at Boston Children's Hospital. He is an associate professor in the Department of Otology and Otolaryngology, correct me if I'm wrong, at Harvard Medical School, and professor of Communication Sciences and Disorders at Massachusetts General Hospital Institute for Health Professions. Thank you, Dr. Shane. Go ahead.
Well, hello, everybody. I guess morning for some, afternoon for others, evening for others, as I understand it. I first heard about facilitated communication in 1990 at the ISAC, the International Society for Augmentative and Alternative Communication Conference in Stockholm, Sweden. I was there and attended a session that Doug Bicklin and Rosemary Crossley presented on this new method of communication. I leaned over to a friend sitting next to me and I said, "This is the craziest thing I ever heard." Now, I said that because of my experience in the field of augmentative and alternative communication. I had set up the first augmentative communication program in the country at Boston Children's Hospital and had a lot of experience with people who had, as Ann McDonald did, cerebral palsy. And we were able to find communication methods that didn't depend on another person holding their hand. Well, after all these years, I still say it's the craziest thing I've ever heard. What I want to do today is focus on augmentative and alternative communication, which in many ways I think is the antidote to facilitated communication because it offers a legitimate means of expression. I'm also going to try to show that it offers a way to actually determine whether a user of FC can actually author their own messages in a non-threatening and non-invasive way. But before I get to that, I want to just give those of you who are not familiar with augmentative communication a quick overview. I could spend hours doing this. I'm going to try to do it in just a few. So I'm going to talk about what's AAC, how is candidacy systematically determined, And then, as I mentioned, how might we look at AAC as a legitimate alternative, and how might we actually use it to test? And we'll get to that shortly. So what's AAC? It's a clinical practice that addresses the needs of individuals with significant and complex communication disabilities. It really is dealing with impairments in speech production and/or comprehension, including spoken and written modes of communication. AAC is not equivalent to technology as some people often think it is. I want to show you a little bit about the display formats that make up AAC. First, there's a grid-like arrangement where you are separating information into target areas, easier to just see it. And this is the sort of the common way of looking at an augmentative communication display. This is a low-tech display. It's basically laminated symbols on cardboard. This is more high-tech, where we're using computers or microprocessor-based systems, and we are then going to be able to access these grids, and with modern technology, when we touch a space, it can talk, it can show video, so there's a lot of opportunity. This is what we're used to. But there's also a growing use of what are called visual scene displays. And visual scene displays, this portrays people and events in actual scenes. And these scenes are used as an interface to language and communication. What do I mean by that? Here's an example of a low-tech. This could be a playroom. If I wanted to talk about, let's say we wanted to do an art project, I would touch that upper left. If something had to do with television, I would touch the television. So it serves as sort of an interface that allows me to be able to have a communication about a particular topic. This is a high-tech version where if I touch the refrigerator door opens, and then I can touch different items. In 1995, I was part of a team that commercialized a program called Companion. And this is the screens from Companion. If I wanted to talk about something on the farm, up in the upper right, I would click on the farm. If I wanted to talk about something in the house, I would click on the house. It would take me to a way of portraying the details of a house. If I wanted to talk about something in the bedroom, I would click on that. If I wanted to say I needed something in a drawer, I would click on the drawer. So this has become in more recent years a much more popular way, especially for individuals who have more cognitive difficulties. So just to see what I mean, here we have on the left the visual scene, and this is a playground scene, and I've deconstructed it. And on the right, you can see the swing and the slide and the sandbox. And if you're from New England, you'd call that a bubbler. Other people call it a water fountain. And that's a way of a different way of conceptualizing it. Interestingly, many years ago, Kathy Drager and others at Penn State did a study to look at children's ability to look at grids versus scenes. And they found that 2.5-year-old children did much better when they were looking at scenes, because it gave them a little better reference. And so scenes seem to work better for some individuals than grids. And of course, we have text. We have keyboards of different types. We're all obviously familiar with that. For some individuals who have significant communication difficulties, minimally verbal, considered non-speaking, they can look at letters that they want and their eyes can meet. And again, this would be text-based. This is called an E-Tran board. I won't get into how you use this, but it's used by people who are non-speaking, and they're able to indicate letters, not just by looking, but there's a coding method. It's called encoding that you can look up, and it's very effective for some individuals. So now I want to get into and talk about some of the devices, peripherals, and access when we think about augmentative and alternative communication. This is a cabinet at our center that started in 1985 at Boston Children's Hospital, and our center still exists. It's the Augmentative Communication Program, part of many other programs within our Communication Enhancement Communication Disorders Center. And what you can see here is a multitude of different kinds of devices. And one of the challenges for any practitioner, whether you're a speech language pathologist or an occupational therapist working within our center, is how do we determine that this particular device or what particular device is most appropriate for a particular individual? So we go through a very systematic process. I want to mention that Dr. Lauren McMahon gave me a lot of input on this. She's an occupational therapist extraordinaire, works with me at the center. So what is Access really? Well, Access, with respect to augmentative communication and assistive technology, Access is an educated, skilled, and evidence-based process to select, to indicate, or to activate. And you see here in one case, you see a switch. I'll be getting into what I mean by switches, but also you have a computer. So when we're talking about AAC Access, we're going to be accessing a real variety of different types of devices and strategies. Successful access enables increased independence, which allows for greater participation in not just communication, as you see at the bottom, but play, leisure, activities of daily living, vocational training, and so forth. So successful access is a hugely important part of the work that we do when we try to find a communication system and other technologies that's going to allow a person who has, for a variety of reasons, difficulties with communication or the ability to be able to control devices and information within their environment. So there are direct and indirect ways to access technology. And I think it's important to understand that as we start to now get drilled down into how we're going to start thinking about augmentative and alternative communication as it relates to individuals on the autism spectrum. So an AAC Access Assessment ends up really looking at both direct access and indirect access. And let me explain what I mean by that. So direct selection refers to the most straightforward means of selecting, indicating, or activating a device, an AAC device or assistive technology device or a peripheral. You touch it, you look directly at it. You can touch it with your hand, you can touch it with a stick on your head, you can touch it with your toe. The fact of the matter is that direct selection is you're doing something directly. Now, when it comes to direct selection, and this I want you to pay particular attention to when you start thinking about access by a person who supposedly needs someone else to hold their hand or their wrist or their shoulder or give them some kind of guidance. There are accommodations that allow for touch to take place, but these can be built right into the operating system. Sometimes we use something called dwell time. So if I'm running my finger over a particular target, remember the grid, and I can't keep it there, or I'm moving it around, but I put dwell time in so that it allows me to be able to, once I get to the location and I can stabilize, it makes the selection. And I can also do things on activate and release. The point I'm trying to make without getting into the fine details is that there are ways of making accommodations that allow touch to take place, even if a person has a tremor or some difficulty with a direct point. There are also adapted keyboards. This is an example of swipe, and some of you may use this on your phones. This actually grew out of an AAC application where you just move your finger and the course that your finger takes on the keyboard spells out the words that you're trying to create. And then there are key guards. Key guards lay over the surface, and this allows the person who has some difficulty with other fingers touching keys. The key guard allows you to be able to rest your hand and be able to find the locations within a scene or within a grid. So again, these are ways to accommodate if a person has direct selection difficulties. For some individuals who have difficulty with specifically extending a finger and pointing, perhaps they can hold a stylus. And you see here a whole range of different stylus that's part of our assessment process. Joysticks. You can hold the joystick, and as you move, the cursor on the screen goes to a particular location. This is also a modified way, a non-touch way of being able to do direct selection. When I get to the key that I want, I have a way of activating and selecting whatever's in that target or whatever the location is within that scene. And we have a whole range of alternative mice, including a head mouse. A head mouse, you wear a sensor on your head, and you notice on top of the computer screen, it's giving off a certain type of signal. And as I move my head, the cursor is moving on the screen. You can see that in the screen on this computer monitor screen, and you can make selections in that way. So again, we can go on and on with a multitude of ways in which we can get information. We have adaptive mice, depending again, where we can make accommodations to the movement difficulties that a person may have. And that takes us to eye tracking. We now, in our center, we have 4 different computer-based systems that all one has to do is look at and select targets. Again, if you program it to how long your eyes have to look at a particular location in order to select whether you're going to, here on the left, pick some application in a computer, or whether you're going to be selecting symbols, or whether you're going to be selecting letters. So eye tracking is non-touch, very high tech, and it's not for everyone, but nothing that I showed you is for everyone. So again, the process of making decisions in an augmentative communication environment setting, assessment setting, is to be able to select that which the person can do and be able to create and communicate in the easiest and the most efficient way. You can also, obviously, we all know now about voice control. When voice control first became available, I mean, it was very exciting. It's unlikely that many FC or RPM candidates will use voice, but I wanted to put that in there. And then we have indirect selection. In indirect selection, we're using different switches. Here, we have a multitude of switch options, and switches are just a specialized piece of equipment used to detect specific input. And I'll show you shortly how the switch is used exactly in an AAC application. But the interesting thing about switches, they can be placed at different locations depending on where on a person's body they're able to have control, where they can do it correctly, they can do it quickly, and they can do it without getting tired. So they can do it on their hands, their thumb. It can be placed near their head. It just doesn't matter. It can be next to your knee, your foot. The whole idea is that we're able to find a location that allow you to be able to make the selection that allows you to be able to control the movement of a cursor. Here we go. If you watch the screen, you'll notice, I'm going to start this little video, and you notice the cursor, that's scanning. And when you hit the switch, it starts to make the selection. At the top is something called linear scanning, and down at the bottom it's called row column scanning, which is more efficient. But the point is that you don't have to be able to touch, you don't have to be able to speak, you don't have to be able to have head control. All you need to do is find one location that you can hit again, hit accurately and without getting tired, and you can select letters and independently create messages using scanning. Now, also just mounting a device to accommodate a person's motor control. I'm going very quickly here, but we have a variety of adaptable mounts for a variety of surfaces. Again, you can put your computer exactly where it needs to go if a person has motor difficulties. And I would propose that it allows for adaptable placement of a display without the need for a facilitator. This could be, consider this for if we were doing rapid prompting. So issues to be addressed here. How is candidacy systematically determined for an AAC device? You know, assessment is a very systematic way of looking at multiple systems. And we use a feature matching approach, which really tries to identify what's appropriate based on a whole range of features, including the person's historical medical history, their sensory needs, their motor needs, their speech and language, behavioral abilities, their educational backgrounds, their cognitive abilities. The point is that to do a proper assessment of AAC, you need to systematically look at this person and look at their previous medical, social, educational, vocational environments, their medical history, their seizure activity, medications, their sensory systems. Do they hear? What is their vision? How large should the symbols be? Should the background for the letters be white or black? Again, which will affect your ability to be able to see. What are their motor considerations, their seating, their positioning, their strength? All of this goes into a systematic evaluation. We look at their speech intelligibility, we look at their language. We want to know what is their level of language understanding and expression. We want to know whether they understand, they recognize symbols. Do they need photographs? Do they use line drawings? Do they really understand text? And so on it goes. And I'm not going to get into all these, but this is what a proper AAC evaluation entails. So I'm not going to get into authorship. Jim covered that. He'll say a little bit more. That's not part of an AAC assessment. FC and RPM are not considered AAC options. I'm going to make just some personal observations from seeing hundreds, if not thousands, of individuals over the years who use AAC. But I'm going to talk about those I've seen who are FC users. Since 1910, that's when actually January of that year when the iPad was delivered, 90% of this is now again, these are personal observations, 90% of FC users were able to navigate a tablet independently. A majority of FC participants use AAC methods, many of them, the ones that I described, before the sudden recognition of literacy and their adoption of FC. All FC users I've evaluated since the early 1980s have been able to eat independently, grasp and pick up small objects, grasp and place small objects into containers, and perform a whole multitude of fine motor tasks. I always ask the question, why did they need someone to hold their hand in order to point? So this for me is an assessment reality, and it has to do with when we're doing an assessment, an experienced, competent AT assessment team applying tools that just were described, find how is it they're able to find ways day after day for the most motorically disabled people on the planet to independently operate or control high and low-tech AAC and other systems. So given that, why not explore independent AAC strategies for individuals who are minimally verbal and are only authoring messages when they are being facilitated? And when I talk about disabled people on the planet, I'm talking about people with Lou Gehrig's disease, cerebral palsy, multiple sclerosis, muscular dystrophy. We can find ways and do every day for people with those extensive, horrific conditions. Yet there's this, it's just, it just doesn't make sense to me that we aren't able to find a way for a person who has autism, who can feed themselves, who can eat themselves, that can pick up objects, aren't able to point and be able to make the selections. I want to just mention, because we're talking about assessment, the Apraxia, what I call the Apraxia Hypothesis. The most common rationale for why facilitated communication is necessary, and this comes out of the book that Jim just mentioned, and that's Bicklund's book in 1990 in the Harvard Education Review. He mentions apraxia, and in fact, Jim's slide showed praxis and autism. There's no data to support the supposition that those who have FC users actually have apraxia. And now keep in mind, despite what you might read on the internet, apraxia is not paralysis, paresis, or incoordination. It's a movement disturbance that's characterized by difficulty with motor planning. It's not a complete inability to perform motor acts. In fact, unlike other conditions, consider modifications to enable independence. Consider if a person has a limb apraxia, which has never been documented to my knowledge for persons who are facilitated communication users, consider larger targets, greater space between the targets, elbow supports to decrease the movement, resulting in less mistakes. Experiment with the dwell time and some of the other accommodations that I mentioned. Thank you, Dr. McMahon, for that assistance. Very often when I've done FC assessments in the past, I found something rather interesting, and I just present this for your own, you can draw your own conclusions. I call it the apple and the A. So I asked the person to select and point to the apple or the bee or the zebra. And very often they can do that. And then I say, well, how about the A or the B or the Z? And that becomes a problem for them. You'll have to answer that for yourself. This is what I call the broom in the floor. At times when I've done evaluations, forgive my little, my creation here, but you put the letters on large 8 by 11 sheets of paper, tape it to the floor, and give the person a stick. And why can't they just walk over and spell? If they can spell, they should be able to spell. They can walk, they can hold the stick, just stand on top of the letters. That's the way that I would think if I was doing an assessment. This isn't exactly an AAC assessment, but it's just something that is, for me, a clinical reality. So how might AAC be more widely used as a legitimate alternative to FC, and how could we test with it? So I asked some questions. First one here, why is it a facilitator needs to hold the hand? So why not explore some of the direct or indirect access options that I had mentioned earlier today? Why not use that as a way of determining authorship? If someone, a facilitator, is necessary to hold the hand, the wrist, the elbow during an FC interaction, and presumably the facilitator is only there for physical support, why don't we just blindfold the facilitator or have them look away? If you watch FC encounters, the facilitator is never moving their eyes away from the keyboard. As noted, while creating text during a rapid prompting interaction, why can't the display just be placed on an easel with the facilitator positioned behind the easel and encouraging the person to point on their own? Why does it have to be held? Said another way, if they have to hold it, explain the reason for that. I just don't get it. I have an unanswered question. Regarding the sudden emergence or presence of literacy, how has this hidden capacity been missed by past educators and therapists? I mean, it's sort of insulting to all the educators in the past and all the therapists who've worked with these individuals. What instruction led to literacy that wasn't realized? How was literacy acquired with no instruction? I mean, how do we even explain the illiteracy in this country if all you need to do is sit at the table in the morning and look at cereal boxes? I want to also point out that it's a clinical reality that there are many minimally verbal children who are able to type independently, And there certainly are children who are hyperlexic, who on their own are learning to, they learn to type on their own, but they're not using facilitated communication to demonstrate those capabilities. So wouldn't a thorough AAC assessment be considered non-threatening and non-invasive to try to see if some type of accommodation for direct touch, eye gaze, scanning? Imagine a person actually being able to do all this on their own. So I'm suggesting this as an opportunity and not a threat. Given the multitude of direct and indirect means of accessing, I hope that that FC and RPM users, their families, therapists, teachers, and advocates welcome the opportunity to explore AAC alternatives as an way to independently talk, text, write a story, a poem, or author messages that are comparable to their level of writing when being assessed, but facilitated. ASHA, this is hot off the press, and this is a draft, but they're now they're coming out with a statement about families beware, controversial method may not result in independent communication, do more harm than good. And they're talking about rapid prompting, and this is about to be released by ASHA. Part of that, they're showing some key differences between AAC, RPM, spelling to communicate, and FC. And if you look here, first column is augmentative alternative communication versus rapid prompting versus facilitated communication. One requires someone to facilitate. There's published science about which one, AAC. Potential for harm to a person with disability and their family. And there's certainly, we can certainly mention all of the sexual abuse cases, and also just being educated in an environment that's not appropriate for you, and so forth. So that's what I have to say. Again, I think that AAC and my background in AAC provides me with some basis for making these claims, and I welcome any questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shane, for that very thorough overview of AAC. I actually learned a lot. We have a ton of questions that came in. I mean, the good news is that along the way, you actually answered many of them. But I'm just going to do two questions before, unfortunately, we have to go to the next speaker. RPM, you lumped in with FC, but this person says, I understand it involves frequent prompts, but not supporting the arm. Can you address that?
Well, with rapid prompting, somebody's holding a display, and that's why I was saying they're holding it, and if I've looked at so many RPM interactions, and actually drawn a mark on the screen, and what you'll notice is that it's moving. And to say that they're not prompting, they're standing behind, are they looking in a certain direction, are they moving it? Is that I would consider that a prompt. I think that Jim's going to talk more about that as well.
All right. Are the improvements, in quote, from FC a result of behavior improvements from one-to-one attention over long durations?
I'm not sure what the questioner means by improvements.
I assume sometimes you hear reports of behavioral improvements.
Oh, I have no question that by sitting with somebody day after day, I've seen this myself. I mean, again, this is an observation that a person becomes calmer, that their behavior improves. I have no doubt about that. I think that, I think it's very, they can form a very warm relationship. They're obviously they're not holding their hand and guiding them all the time. I think that I would consider that a benefit, but that doesn't mean they can spell. It means that they can their behavior can improve.
All right. Well, thank you. So many good questions. Hopefully at the end, we can return to some of these. I'm going to ask you to turn off your video, and we will turn to our next speaker, Ralf Schlosser. Dr. Schlosser is a professor in communication sciences and disorders at Northeastern University in Boston. He also serves as the director of clinical research at the Center for Communication Enhancement Autism Language Program, Boston Children's Hospital. He has published extensively on AAC interventions for children with autism spectrum disorder and other developmental disabilities, and has a scholarly interest in evidence-based practices and research methodology. He currently serves as editor-in-chief of Augmentative and Alternative Communication, the flagship journal of the AAC field. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. So I will talk a little bit more about evidence today. And Jim already covered some of the individual studies, but I'm going to talk a little bit more about systematic reviews and synthesis of these studies and what the findings are of those. So let me share my screen here. Okay. All right, so the first study, first review that I want to talk about was conducted in 2014. So at the time, Aac, the International Society for Augmentative and Alternative Communication, constituted an ad hoc committee on FC, and I was chairing that committee. So in order to arrive at a position statement, we undertook a systematic review of the literature. And so this paper is available for free downloads at the journal website. If you go to that link on the bottom, you can download it for free. And basically, the goal was to look at all the authorship studies and to see what they say and come up with a conclusion based on the evidence. Now, I understand that many folks in the audience are parents and may not be totally familiar with what a systematic review is. So basically, instead of relying on any one individual study, we are looking at the synthesis of all the studies that are available on a given topic. So any one study cannot prove anything one way or the other, but if you're looking at the totality of all the studies conducted, then we can draw a more conclusive sort of statement at the end. So that was the intent. So here's the findings. This is directly taken from the abstract. So we only focused on studies that really provided an experimental analysis of authorship. And what we found that there was unequivocal evidence of facilitator control. So in other words, the messages generated through FC were authored by the facilitators rather than the individuals with disabilities. Therefore, based on this review, FC is not only not effective, but it has no validity. There's a slight difference between those two. For example, you could say a technique is not effective because it doesn't produce the change that is anticipated. But in this case, not only does it not produce the change that is anticipated, but it's actually it's worse than that, because the voice of the facilitator is imposed onto the voice of the individual with a disability. So so that's why the best way to describe it is it has no validity. Okay. So let me go back here quickly. So on the right-hand side, you see there's a link to the Aac position statement, and that is also free to download. So it's based on this review. And a group of us then proceeded to conduct an update of the 2014 review, thinking that there could be new studies that were conducted on authorship. And so we did this in 2018, was published in the Autism and Developmental Language Impairments Journal. So the goal was basically to see, is there any new evidence that has come in? Do we need to change our conclusions based on the new evidence? And here is the conclusion of the abstract. We found no new studies on authorship. So there remains no evidence that FC is a valid form of communication for individuals with severe communication disabilities. Okay, so again, the conclusions from the 2014 review therefore stand and are still up to date. That's the latest one that I'm aware of from 2018 on FC. So now I'm going to turn to rapid prompting. So we have conducted a systematic review on rapid prompting, and this informed the position statement that later came out with ASHA. And so again, our goal was to determine, does RPM result in the changes that are proposed by the developer of RPM? And that was our intent. And so we conducted, again, a systematic review. And these are our findings. Unfortunately, or fortunately, however you want to look at it, we found no evidence, meaning we found no studies that met our inclusion criteria that RPM results in the claims purported by the developer and its proponents. So therefore, at this point, RPM is an unsupported technique. Okay, so there's no evidence that it works. There's also no evidence that it doesn't work at this time. So rightfully so, Lang et al. Stated that the of most significant concern or need is a study that examines authorship of the messages generated by RPM. And the reason for that is because of the similarity of RPM and FC, meaning that the underlying mechanism of change is the same with RPM as it is for FC. And Jim already pointed that out, and so did Howard. So here's a little drawing. It's the same action that's underlying RPM and FC. And Janyce is going to talk a little bit more about the ideomotor effect, and I believe that Jim will address expectancy bias and confirmation bias a little bit more. But you know, the underlying method is the same, and therefore we consider RPM to be part of the group of facilitated communication methods, regardless of what the name is. And because of this, it is our hypothesis that RPM will result in the similar kind of authorship outcomes as did FC. But as I said, as of yet, there are no authorship studies published that examine this question. And just to reiterate, we need to have these authorship studies done. Okay, so if you are a parent and you're considering RPM for your child, I would strongly encourage you to do a test of authorship with your child before you actually commit to RPM. Since we don't have any research evidence to say anything about this, the best thing that you could do as a parent is to definitely test for authorship.
When you say test for authorship, can you clarify what you mean?
Basically make sure that it is the child who is communicating the messages and not the facilitator. So I think Jim will talk a little bit more, and Janyce will talk a little bit more about how this testing can be done, but basically is a double-blind test where sometimes the child sees the same picture and then types out a message, the same picture as a facilitator, and sometimes the pictures are different. And if the child was really communicating independently, the child would be typing out the name of the picture that the child sees and not what the facilitator saw. That's what I mean by testing.
Thank you. Sorry, You need to unmute yourself. Sorry. That was my bad. Okay.
Okay. I hope I answered your question. Okay. So now I'm going to, beyond the systematic reviews that I just mentioned, there are other purveyors of evidence, and I'm going to talk about two of those. So the National Standards Project is conducted by the May Institute in Massachusetts, and they're looking at all evidence-based treatments and what the evidence behind it is. And the latest report that they have, it's free to download at the URL below. They consider facilitated communication an unestablished intervention, as you can see, along with many other treatment methods. So, okay, the next one I wanted to talk about is the most recent one. Another purveyor of evidence-based information sources is the National Clearinghouse on Autism Evidence and Practice. So this just came out. They came out with a report. It's about 140 pages long. You can download it for free at the UNC website. And so this is another organization that takes stock of evidence of autism treatments. And so I wanted to show you that, first of all, RPM and FC are considered unsupported, but I wanted to show you that augmentative and alternative communication, as defined by, by the techniques that Howard talked about, for example, manual communication boards, speech generating devices, using general purpose mobile technologies with AAC applications, manual signs, picture exchange communication system, and so on and so on. There are many, many more that this is considered to be an effective group of interventions. And so there's support behind that. And this independent agency has declared it to be evidence-based. But keep in mind, as many before have already said, that FC and RPM are not included in this definition of augmentative and alternative communication. Now, I want to conclude by speaking a little bit about these recent studies, or some of them are actually not that recent, where researchers focus on the linguistic analysis of output produced by individuals who are being facilitated, and then they're determining that based on the nature of this output, that it can't possibly be the facilitator who produced these messages because of the specific nature of the output. Likewise, we have eye tracking studies that are being conducted, and they are the most recent one by Jaswell, and they are examining basically where the individual is focusing their eyes on the display, and again they're inferring from that they are the authors of these messages. So the reason I entitled this slide "Too Little, Too Late" is the following. We already have direct evidence that the authorship is produced by the facilitator. The evidence that is generated by these kinds of studies are presuming that the authorship is produced by the individual with disability. And that is an unjustifiable assumption that is being made. So these folks who produce these studies are not testing the authorship first and then proceeding to do a linguistic analysis. They are not producing an authorship test first and then producing eye tracking results. Rather than that, they're skipping the authorship examination and yet draw inferences about authorship through indirect evidence. The reason I have a problem with this, as a researcher, we always try to do direct evidence first. If you can't get direct evidence, that's more powerful than indirect. To give you a little analogy, if I was running a red light and which I of course never do. But if I was running a red light and the police officer has a videotape of me running a red light, and then I come along and say, hey, I'm going to dispute that because I have eyewitnesses who saw me not running the red light. So that's too little too late, because the video evidence is direct, whereas we all know that eyewitnesses sometimes can be wrong. Okay, so we're coming with indirect evidence after direct evidence has been produced over years and years and years is just too little too late. And with that, I'm going to stop. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Schlosser. I'm going to pitch a few questions to you.
Sure.
What do you make of the new study on eye tracking in an FC context by Jaswal et al.? Maybe you can explain that study a little bit and then give your perspective.
Well, that's exactly what I was just talking about, the eye tracking. That's an example. And I'm not going to really take that study apart. Instead, I'm going to refer the person who was asking that question to a blog post by Catherine Beals. She analyzed the study from beginning to end, and I would strongly encourage you that you check that out. There are so many flaws in the study, besides what I just pointed out, that is a worthwhile read and to get a good sense of it.
Got it. Very good. What do you make of people who, I'm kind of consolidating a bunch of questions into one here, but people who use FC and these assisted or facilitated methods, but then are able to achieve independent communication, whether using a pencil or by typing. Do you see cases like that? And in that case, is the use of FC legitimate in a way because it was a means to an end?
Okay, so I'm going to ask this, I'm going to respond to that as a researcher. There may be individuals who are independent now, but to make draw this conclusion that it must have been FC that contributed to that is a very tedious hypothesis to make, because in research, retrospective work is difficult to put the pieces together. How was the FC presented? How many sessions? Was the FC provided consistently? Was the facilitator trained properly? And so on. And most importantly, what if the person was already independent to begin with, but it was never tested? So, to go backwards and to make that point is very difficult to prove.
Okay, great. One strong theme in the questions is really about how come we aren't testing this? I mean, how come, what can we do, right, as an autism community to do better testing of these methods? Apparently, the founder of RPM won't allow RPM to be subjected to these sorts of tests. I don't know about other forms. What can we do to move this forward and get more clarity?
Well, I think, when somebody proposes a new technique in the field of communication science and disorders, oftentimes what we see, the first evidence that comes out about the technique is usually from the developer, him or herself. Okay, there are dozens and dozens of examples of that. For example, fast forward, that's a method. Initial evidence, or the Litcomb approach, it's peculiar, given that RPM has been around for such a long time already, quite a long time, that there has not been any evidence from the developer. Of course, it comes with all kinds of problems to have evidence from the developer, but to begin with, that's peculiar that we have not seen that yet. And there was a study that was about to be published in the Journal of Autism and Developmental Disorders on authorship testing of RPM and the pro RPM people got involved and convinced the participant to withdraw their consent, and so the paper could not be published. So there's a tendency in this community to avoid testing at all costs. And so if you're really concerned about helping people communicate, wouldn't you want to lay that to rest and solve the problem? Determine, there is authorship. If you're really concerned about helping people, but that's a question mark. Are they really, or are they just in it for the money?
Thank you. And then I'm just going to throw in one more question that just came in. What would you suggest to an educator who knows RPM doesn't work, but has been mandated to use it by an administrator because of a legal case brought by the parents?
Okay, would you mind repeating that? Sorry.
What would you suggest to an educator? So I guess that would be a teacher, maybe a speech therapist in a school district who knows RPM doesn't work, but has been mandated to use it due to a legal case brought by the parents?
Well, as if it's an educator or SLP, I'm not sure about educator, but SLPs have a code of ethics that they have to abide by from the ASHA, American Speech Language Hearing Association, and I would recommend that the SLP in that case consult with ASHA whether they're actually able to implement that and not violate the code of ethics. If they do violate the code of ethics, they always have the option to refer the client to somewhere else. It's a tricky situation if they're mandated to do it. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you. All right, thank you so much. And now we will move on to our next speaker. Janyce Boynton is a speech language clinician. In the early 1990s, she became involved with FC. Her story is well documented. She is one of the few facilitators to publicly acknowledge her role in producing FC messages and speak out against its use. She's currently co-hosting a series of talks on the About Time YouTube channel with Susan Gerbic, exploring the many facets of FC. All right, Janyce, can you share your video?
Yeah, I'm getting
share your screen.
It says I can't start my video.
Okay.
It says you can't start your video because, okay, here we go.
All righty.
There we go.
Yeah, and now you can share your screen.
Okay. Thank you for this opportunity. 29 years ago, I participated in double-blind testing because allegations of abuse were falsely brought against the family of a student of mine through facilitated communication messages. Testing showed that the messages were the facilitator's, mine, and not those of the student. The allegations were dropped, but I was left confused and with a ton of questions. I spent a good deal of time in the intervening years trying to figure out what happened and why. And thanks to experts from all over the world, like those I share this panel with today, I've learned a great deal about how FC quote unquote works. First, let me say that facilitators are faced with an impossible task. One is to prompt their clients or loved ones, which is built into FC and RPM and all its variants, and simultaneously not prompt them in order to produce independent communications. I say impossible because the facilitator's actions are inextricably linked to making FC quote unquote work. Take the facilitator away and the written output deteriorates significantly, often to the point of limited or no intelligibility. Dependence in the case of FC and RPM does not equal independent. And part of the reason for this problem is a phenomenon known as the ideomotor or ideomotor response or non-conscious muscle movement. The scientific community recognized and wrote about the ideomotor response in the mid-1800s. Magicians for centuries have relied on the ideomotor response to carry out their illusions, and with apologies to magicians, why do you think they need to hold on to someone to find an object while blindfolded? Researchers have demonstrated the idiomotor response in automatic writing, dowsing, and using a planchette on the Ouija board. And holding on to another person's hand while typing essentially creates the same movements as using a planchette, where the small muscle movements of the individuals involved cause motions or typing actions that to the participants feels like the activity is coming from someone other than themselves. Holding a board in the air produces the same effects, which I'll show in a minute. Had proponents done their due diligence, they would have recognized the similarities between FC and using a planchette and set up controls to rule it out before marketing the discovery to an unsuspecting public. FC, by the way, shares the same guidelines that using the Ouija board. Both discourage people from testing the messages and or approaching it with a skeptical frame of mind. As a way to consciously experience the idiomotor effect, you might try something like the grommet, this toy here. The goal is to get all the discs lined up in a row without having them twist out of alignment as in the image. It takes concentration to make it work. It's possible, but much harder to keep the discs aligned while carrying on a conversation. And if you don't have a grommet, you can simply put a marble or two on a plate and try keeping them still while you carry on a conversation. It might work for a few seconds, but as soon as you turn your attention away from balancing the plate, the marbles will start rolling across the surface. Shifts in your fingers, wrists, arm, head, body will affect the movement, even if you don't consciously feel like you're moving the plate. Now, a friend of mine did an informal experiment with several people on a Ouija board, and they noticed that after a few minutes of holding onto an unmoving planchette, someone in the group would get tired and their wrists would drop slightly, edging the planchette forward. I suspect this happens with facilitators as well. Miko Kazuka wrote an article in 1997 called The Role of Touch in Facilitated Communication and demonstrated just how easy it is to influence the motion of a typed response when two individuals are typing together. Minute movement is all that's needed. Facilitators are asked to maintain superhuman concentration on their own, often non-conscious muscle movements while holding on to another person's wrist, elbow, or shoulder, or holding a board in the air, all while carrying on an active conversation, calling out letters, remembering words previously spelled out, redirecting their client or loved one, reacting to people and things in their environment. In other words, multitasking. If FC and RPM messages are solely the words of non-speaking individuals, facilitators would have to be in control of those small muscle movements 100% of the time, which can't be done. And here's how I believe the idiomotor response works in facilitated communication. In this picture, the facilitated letter is in the upper right-hand part of the keyboard. Let's say they're typing the letter I. Excuse me, just a sec. If the facilitator believes this is the correct choice for the word being spelled, he or she will tense up, stopping the sweeping or search motion and signaling to press down. This tension is slight and probably not something the facilitator notices. According to a study by Daniel Wegner on uncontrolled intelligences and FC, she can't help it. Her brain signals that this is the correct letter, and so she non-consciously stops. For those of you who do crossword puzzles, you know that only so many letters will logically follow another letter. In this example, I. And if it's the start of a sentence, maybe the logical progression would be I am. If it's the start of a question, maybe the logical progression would be is the. In any event, after the I is pressed, the facilitator non-consciously releases tension and the search begins for the next letter. Both the letters A and S, for example, are on the left side of the keyboard. And if their hand movement appears to be going toward the right side of the keyboard, the facilitator will non-consciously tense up as the motion goes away from the target letter. If the movement swings toward the left, the movement will be smooth and easy until the person's finger nears the next desired letter. Then the facilitator will again tense up. She can't help it. Let's say the typing duo press the letter A and the process starts all over again. With the letter A selected, by the way, the facilitator is cleared up in her mind whether this is a question or a start of a statement. What letters follow next will have to follow the logical constructs of language and literacy, which the facilitator knows but the individual being facilitated may or may not. This thought process and ongoing decision-making by the facilitator happens very quickly, and I probably wouldn't have made this connection except during the double-blind testing that I participated in, a situation where I was more vigilant than in unstructured settings. I noticed myself at times searching for answers to unfamiliar questions, or what was the color of Uncle so-and-so's car and the like. I call these breakthrough moments where I was consciously aware that the facilitated chatter in my head, which is more like an author writing a story than anything else, differed from my own conscious thoughts. I think this happens to most, if not all, facilitators as well, but in unstructured settings, the movements move too quickly in and out of consciousness to register. I moved the kid's hand this time, but I won't next time, and you're off and running. As facilitators, we remember the quote unquote hits. Those are the times we think FC messages are real or RPM, and forget the misses, times we're not so sure or are simply wrong. We want FC and RPM to work so badly, we're willing, perhaps even primed by the training, to dismiss any doubts we have about our own influence on the activity for fear of looking like we're not presuming competence. With rapid prompting method or spelling to communicate, the influence of the ideomotor response is slightly different, but with the same result of facilitator influence. To get RPM to quote unquote work, all you need is an individual willing to point their finger in the general direction of the board, and the facilitator controls the rest. In the picture shown, there are several ways the facilitator can inadvertently cue the individual being facilitated to spell out words. Slight pressure changes on the hand on the shoulder can signal when to move forward, backward, left, right, even though it looks like the individual is quote unquote independently pointing. The board in the air is affected by the facilitator's shift in body weight, how tired his arm is from holding the board, and non-conscious movements, left, right, up, down, backwards, forwards, as he helps the individual spell. He can't help it. If he knows the answer or thinks he knows the answer, he's going to direct the board where needed to make the correct choices. Having the board securely placed on a table or stand would, if not eliminate, at least reduce the problem of this type of cueing. There's other types, but we're talking about the ideomotor response. I'd like to point out that sometimes with these stencil-like boards, the pencil gets stuck on unexpected letters. Say it gets caught in the W when the facilitator is expecting the next letter to be an S. Following a facilitator's logic that this is an independent action on the part of his client, the facilitator is now forced to continue the activity and in a split second come up with a word that makes sense. This also happens when the wrong letters are pressed during typing. This causes the unusual spellings facilitators are told to take as quote unquote proof of independence, and I believe creates the unusual language constructs that facilitators call poetry. Facilitators believe that fading support from the wrist to the shoulder reduces the amount of facilitator control, but long hours working together reduces the amount of pressure or the expansiveness of a movement needed to make changes. Recognizable spelling patterns happen. H often follows T, or S often follows I, making the activity appear fluid and rapid. Small tugs on this individual's shirt cue him to move his arm left or right, up or down, stop moving when his finger hovers over the desired letter. These cues can become so subtle, they're difficult to pick up if you're not looking for them or believe they aren't there. Again, look to the magicians and illusionists to see whether this works or not. Other physical cues include shifts in body weight, head nods, and less subtly grabbing the individual's arm or moving the keyboard itself. This facilitator is holding on to her son's back. You can't tell from the still image, but her eyes are almost always directed at the keyboard, which is standard practice for facilitators. And in addition, her fingers constantly move. These small movements control what part of the keyboard her son points to, left or right. Changes in pressure also signal him to move his finger down to press a letter or up to wait for the next prompt. The individual constantly looks at his facilitator for approval or reassurance, which is exactly backwards from AAC, where the assistant checks in with the individual to make sure the output is accurate. In this example of rapid prompting method, the facilitator holds the board in the air while her client points to letters or at least stretches his finger in the general vicinity of the board, sometimes without looking. As we know by now, the facilitator movement and cueing is an issue whenever the board is held in the air. The translucent letter board also allowed us to slow down the video and see that the person being facilitated often pointed in between letters with no distinct choices. The facilitator called out the names of letters that she thought fit with the words being spelled, regardless of what part of the letterboard was touched. This session at times looked believable in that the individual pointed to the board without being physically touched by the facilitator, but that's not the whole story with RPM. Facilitators can and do prompt their clients and control the type messages without realizing the extent to which this happens. There's nothing in the literature that says that facilitators are doing this on purpose. It's more that they don't understand how cueing happens. Along with physical cues, vocal inflections too can signal the start or end of a word as facilitators call the letters out. The facilitator's voice goes up or stays even when he or she expects more letters to come, C, A, and goes down when he or she expects the word or sentence to end, T. Recent RPM literature puts forth the idea that rapid choices prevent facilitators from influencing letter selection, but I'd argue that at times the rapidness of the pointing prevents facilitators from having the processing time to determine, one, if there's a solid letter choice made, two, the name of the letter and how it fits in with the word being spelled out, and missing the accuracy of the next letter by having to call out and remember the ones preceding it because the typing is happening so quickly. As an aside, I listened to a facilitated session once with headphones, and the individual was pounding the letterboard so hard and so rapidly, I reflexively closed my eyes. I wonder how often this happens with facilitators and how they can process the letters with their eyes closed. In addition, letterboards like this don't have a way to record the typing session, so the outcome is solely reliant on the facilitator's perceptions and memory without input from the individual being subjected to facilitation. Finally, I find it both curious and frustrating that despite the large body of evidence demonstrating facilitator influence, proponents have not significantly changed their techniques in the years since I was a facilitator. In fact, we were instructed in the training I took not to hold the board in the air for the reasons I already outlined. Well-meaning facilitators are asked to do the impossible when it comes to FC and RPM. They're tasked with providing prompts and cueing to promote independent communication using techniques that foster non-conscious muscle movements. These movements increase the chances of facilitator influence, not decrease it, and makes the typing feel like it is coming from someone else, so it's easy to fall into a credulous frame of mind. I also find it irresponsible that testing for facilitator influence, with all that we know about the ideomotor response, is discouraged by these people and not encouraged. And personally, I wouldn't trust one facilitated word without it. Just yesterday, we published a facilitatedcommunication.org website that provides more information about the evidence base and kind of goes through some of the history of facilitated communication. So please check that out if you can. I appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Thank you, Janyce, very much. I'll just pitch one question because we do have one more talk and I'll save time for questions. But why do you think people so want to believe? Do people want to find a genius within in order for that person to have value? And thank you for your honesty.
Yeah, I think a couple things. I think that facilitators really sincerely want to help the person they're working with, whether it's a loved one or a client, and they're willing to try. Some people are willing to try anything. Maybe they don't have the critical thinking skills to understand the evidence about FC and RPM, but they're also told by universities like Syracuse and some other reputable places, University of Virginia, Cal Lutheran, there's a bunch of organizations that this is actually legitimate when it isn't. And so if you're kind of predisposed to that belief system and really want to make something work and want to help out, then you try it and get into it without really understanding what's happening. You know, you kind of convince yourself that it works, and I think it's a promise, the promise of reaching inside that person and helping them release whatever's inside them.
All right, thank you. With that, we will return to our first speaker. Dr. Todd, if you can get yourself back online and share your screen if you can. Let's see. All right, and oops, sorry. We just do another, perfect. Okay, you're good.
Okay. Yes, I totally agree with Janyce. I've met a lot of facilitated communication parents, and virtually all of them seem sincere and loving. And when they get angry with folks like us, they're obviously and sincerely, most of the time, trying to protect the integrity of the relationship. And they're worried about having something that is extremely valuable and important removed from them. And I totally understand that. I totally get that. My concern is with the professionals whose job is different, and that's what we're going to talk about next here. And they've got a different responsibility. And it's a critical one. So let's see if I can get my screen shared properly here in the place. I think it's here. I guess if anybody could confirm that I'm seeing it, or maybe not. Here it is.
You're good.
Okay, cool. I'm going to talk about FC RPM harms, and this is going to be rather it's going to be kind of a rambling thing, but we're eventually going to coalesce around codes of ethics. That's why I referenced the professionals who I think in their advocacy of these things, they're failing the parents and others who end up doing these things and wanting them, and they're failing themselves and their disciplines. So let's talk a little bit about these harms, and let's just outline them. We've heard them before, so I don't have to go into detail. There's the false accusations, and there's no question that these are false accusations, and we end up with even more problems in court when we find, for example, that you have witnesses who can't be witnesses, and it obfuscates everything. And like I said, this fellow, Julian Wendrow, spent 70 days in solitary confinement due to accusations that it was rather easily discovered his daughter couldn't possibly have made. So think about 70 days in solitary confinement. And there's opportunity cost, and I'm going to give a few illustrations. Facilitated communication and rapid prompting and things like them take the place of other therapies. There's certainly people who are doing more than one thing, but here's PECS. It's a communication system that might be more effective than a facilitator taking the voice away from a child with autism. Or here's some sort of occupational therapy that could be done instead. And I often see these folks doing facilitated communication for years and years, and you go to a conference or something like that, and people who seem perfectly I'm stumbling over my words, perfectly physically capable of doing so are having to be helped, for example, to go to the bathroom or toilet, or tie their own shoes and things like that. So something has clearly been missed. Speech and language therapy that might result in vocal communication or other forms of communication that are clearly and unarguably independent and helpful for the person in adapting to a variety of situations. Or behavior therapies. You could learn, for example, I've just picked arbitrarily toilet training in less than a day. It's fine if it takes more than a day for me, but training something, teaching something like this, helping somebody learn to comport themselves in some sort of setting, make change, speak, whatever it happens to be, or not doing therapy at all. Instead of having somebody doing rapid prompting or facilitated communication and producing the words of the facilitator, they could be out playing. Or they could even be doing less. They could be sleeping. They could be eating donuts. Anything might be better. Okay. And we have the issue of deception. Now, much of this deception is self-deception, and I don't mean it in a malevolent way. It's nobody trying to hurt somebody, except maybe some professionals. But the messages aren't real. Somebody is being fooled into thinking they're speaking to somebody, and the messages that they're getting back are legitimate. And even if it produces good feelings, it's good feelings produced from falsity, which is, I think, a harm. Okay, now let's talk about codes of ethics. And I don't want to go too long over, but I've picked a few. The American Psychological Association Code of Ethics, the Behavior Analysis Certification Board Code of Ethics that's actually derived from the APA Code of Ethics. So you'll see that they're similar in their ways of going. Even Safe Sport. One of the ironies of the facilitated communication and rapid prompting situation is that if your kid is in Little League Baseball or something like that, the people surrounding them are probably held to a higher and more formal ethical standard than the facilitated communication purveyors are. That's where we are in terms of the protection of the facilitated communication client from the behavior of the professional advocates. And let's talk about the basic features of mature codes of ethics. The reason I picked these codes of ethics is not to say that they're the best, but they're particularly mature and particularly attuned to the problems that are created when humans relate with other humans in situations of anxiety, stress, harm, need, things like that. And these codes of ethics, mature codes of ethics, advocate beneficence and non-maleficence. That means you do good and avoid harm. Okay. They all recognize, good codes of ethics recognize the dangers of power differentials in relationships. They also recognize the danger of multiple relationships when the relationship has more than one dimension to it. For example, maybe you're the person's doctor and their golf partner and you're renting a house from them. That would be a multiple relationship. They all advocate consistency of practice with the best available information relevant to the topic at hand. And they all have some means or interest in protecting the rights of the individual who is the target, purchaser, recipient of the intervention, however they came to be in the intervention situation. Now let's talk about beneficence and non-maleficence. There are literally zero sound scientific studies showing FC or RPM work as claimed. There are over 30 scientific studies showing how and why FC specifically fails, and there are thousands of studies going back over a century showing how and why activities like RPM and FC can result, and often do result, in unconscious influence of one person over the other, with the, like I said, unconscious, with the person doing the influence not being aware of it. That's, in fact, there's a name for that. That's called the Transcendental Temptation, when you come to believe that you're not actually physically, gesturally, verbally influencing somebody, that somehow there's something going on by itself. There are dozens of cases of false accusations of abuse, including even 2 documented rapes of people who can't speak. So when we're talking about avoiding harm, we're talking about avoiding big harm. It's not just the false accusations of abuse, but we have facilitators who are literally typing out their own sexual consent. Given all this, the main and safest operating assumption must be that FC and its variants can't bring the benefits claimed. That is, the communications are arising from the facilitator. That needs to be the default assumption. Now, people listening may disagree with that, but we certainly have lots of evidence that that's what's happening in the cases that we've investigated. The judicial evidence from these false accusation cases points to immense direct personal harm to numerous falsely accused individuals, including, in some cases, permanent bars to employment in human services due to the accusations alone, even after the individuals are totally exonerated. When FC is put in mandatory, and this is very important, when FC is put in mandatory reporting situations, as it often is in schools, treatment centers, and things like that, even accusations that lack any inherent credibility often have to be forwarded, even despite the misgivings of the people doing the forwarding, usually to people who don't know the problems associated with FC, police, social service agencies, and then they go on and run the person through the system. Charge first, investigate later. And I've seen a number of cases that I've dealt with that were exactly that the people making the accusations doubted them, or people making the forwarding doubted them. Power differentials, let's talk about them. FC RPM and their variants are about as close to the Platonic ideal of a power differential as anything can be in human services. A speaking person who lives independently with full freedom of movement is physically manipulating a vulnerable person, and I mean vulnerable sometimes in the technical legal sense. That person typically doesn't independently speak or otherwise conventionally communicate, is very often a child, rarely lives on their own, rarely has freedom of movement, and is almost always under guardianship. The very words attributed to the user are produced by the physical domination of one person or another. And I don't mean physical domination, pushing and shoving and things like that, but moving the person's hand, causing them to do something that might not otherwise happen. This is a power differential. The FC, RPM, and their variants are built on somebody controlling somebody else. In some cases, it's even claimed that only one facilitator has developed the necessary rapport to mediate the communication. We've run into this in court cases all the time where somebody says, well, let's bring in an independent facilitator who doesn't know the details of the case to see if the same messages are then produced. And the claim that often pops out when that is offered is, well, this person is not going to be able to have the rapport that the regular facilitator does. And let's look at the implications of that. That means that facilitator is always and inherently protected from accusations of harm from the individual being facilitated. So if that facilitator is doing something troublesome, the facilitated person can't speak out because they can't speak independently and sometimes physically powerless against the facilitator. That's what we saw in the Stubblefield case. That's what we saw in the rape case in Australia. Even if FC worked exactly as its proponents claim, and I'll include rapid prompting in this, if things went bad, the facilitator would still always have the potential to control the output, potentially obfuscating any valid accusations made against them or their friends, for example, by typing something different or conflicting. Or they could manufacture retaliatory allegations against others at will, which seems to have happened in a case in Michigan in the early 1990s. And they are protected from culpability by the attribution of the output to the facilitated individual. It wasn't me, it's this person I'm facilitating. So you see the dangers of the power differential in this case. The facilitator can make what they need to make happen, while the person who is not being facilitated, even if it worked, can't do anything when the person is away. Multiple relationships, let's talk about them. The Facilitated Communications Training Standards in 2000 explains that the facilitator is not just a person who makes the communication possible, but is a friend, therapist, personal advocate, and even potentially a sexual advisor. And if you don't think this is true, go and look at this book, I Might Be You, that has passages where the facilitator has produced the typing about various sexual devices and things like that. And this is a Ph.D. who's done this. Or look at this textbook, The Politics of Occupational Centered Practice, that actually recommends that facilitators enter into sexual relationships with clients. So, the closest thing that FC has to an ethical code, and rapid prompting doesn't have anything, and this isn't even close, explicitly endorses multiple relationships without also including any explicit protections against the problems they create. mature codes of ethics go through hundreds of words about how to deal with multiple relationships, what to do if you're forced into them, for example, if you're a small town therapist. All of these things are covered. Facilitated communication, rapid prompting, create multiple relationships and endorse them, and then don't leave any mechanism for them to be mitigated. There is no code of ethics, there's no licensing, there's no central certifying, nothing. And in fact, there is an insidious inherent vice in FC and its variants in putting the facilitator in the role of protector and advocate. In both FC and RPM and their variants, both FC and RPM and their variations demand that facilitators protect their subjects against any and all attempts to validate communication. They refuse. They say it's awful, insult. We'll come to that again. But the facilitator isn't actually protecting the rights of the supposed user by that, whose actual veracity would be important to know, especially given the doubts of FC and RPM. So if you believe these things worked, now that we found hundreds of instances that don't work and you believe it does, now it's even more important to demonstrate in a scientifically valid, incontrovertible way that the communication is real. But that is steadfastly refused not only at the individual level, but the programmatic level, as we've seen in the RPM case. So they're protecting themselves rather than protecting the client. And the facilitators are, by refusing to do validation, protecting themselves from any evidence that they are engaged in unconscious or conscious manipulation. And let's talk about multiple relationships at the risk of prolonging this too long. There is a story in this book. You should find this book or find some account of it, where the facilitator is facilitating, a single facilitator is facilitating both sides of a romantic relationship. The man and the woman, both non-speaking, are having a verbal romantic relationship, and she is literally going back and forth between the two. So this person's the facilitator. This person's essentially the AAC device. This person is a friend and advocate of one. This person's a friend and advocate of the other, and is an independent person and supposedly mediating the conversation for both sides. If that's not a multiple relationship and probably the epitome of one, I don't know what is. Of course, there's nothing in FC or RPM to protect against the problems that you might imagine occur in something like that. Now, we're supposed to use the best information available. I'm perfectly willing to admit that my discipline, psychology, has not been as good as its word on this, using the most scientific stuff. We've made some really horrendous, just boneheaded mistakes. Like, here is an article in the New York Times. So of course the journalists are making the same boneheaded mistake. But Light Whitmer, considered the father of clinical psychology, was taken in by a trained circus chimp, as were the New York Times reporters. And he wrote articles about this. I read this in some of my historical research, and I'm wondering what happened to Light Whitmer, who seemed like a pretty bright guy, to let himself be taken in by a chimpanzee wearing clothes and smoking, but he was. It's easy. And why do I bring up Albert Einstein? Because one of the problems of psychology is this stuff is happening at the same time Einstein is publishing the special theory of relativity. So you see the scientific status of one versus the other. But let's fast forward to 1929. Here is Lady Wonder, the typing psychic horse, with Claudia Fonda, and nobody's touching this horse, and the horse will reliably produce the words that are needed through cueing. But we know how the cueing was done. This riding crop here is the cue. Now this horse, if you look at this horse, you see these hip points and other things. This is a horse that is never ridden. Why does a horse that's never ridden need a riding crop? Well, the movement of the riding crop was the cues, and the horse reliably learned to follow those. But this is an example of what I call the inscrutable obvious, the thing that is in the setting that seems to belong, that does not actually need to be there. So for example, in rapid prompting, you shouldn't need to hold up the letterboard in the air, because in the rapid prompting sequence, they start with the items on the table. Soma personally told me, when I asked her, why are you holding the thing up in the air? She said that people with autism have trouble looking down. Well, the same guy had been looking down just minutes before. So obviously that is an excuse. But here's the thing about the scientists. In 1929, 2 articles were published essentially validating the psychic abilities of this horse by scientists who were unable to find the inscrutable obvious when Claudia Fonda decided to take one over on them. Okay, plenty of people in my discipline are behind the times or find themselves engaged in suboptimal practices. We're still doing the Rorschach and draw a hand test, all these things, even demonstrably ineffective ones, and are sometimes taken in by tricks. But let's go back to this. I've said this before. There is 0 good scientific evidence that FC, RPM, or any of their variants work. There is plenty of scientific evidence against them, and things like that being bona fide means of communication. And this is from a wide variety of areas. I don't know if you can see this, artifact in behavioral research. We have lost sight of Robert Rosenthal's work on unconscious influence in controlled experiment, and not in controlled experimental settings, but in social settings, and Paul Meehl too. This isn't a judgment call about a seemingly likely therapy that has marginal positive evidence, maybe something that had promise but doesn't work, and people continue to work on it, hoping it'll find its way in the treatment world. We found that about 3 dozen studies involving about 400 subjects have produced no clear evidence of FC working. This isn't a judgment call at all. There are people out there probably listening, writing comments going, well, I know this case and that case. I mean, we're sitting here with 400 failures. Obviously, the thing doesn't work very often. It fails most of the time. And there's simply no reason, given the best available information, that a properly trained, ethical, credentialed professional should use or recognize FC, RPM, or things like them in interventions for anyone. Even if you believe that they work or they have potential to work, it has to be premature. Why are you using something that out of 400 some subjects in experimental studies where the control is simply not telling the facilitator what the answer is, it fails? This is pretty bad. Now let's talk about the rights of the individuals. I think this is the last session if you're getting tired of hearing me. The rights of the intervention and the rights of an individual in an intervention are the same as everybody else's. In fact, these codes of ethics often state that explicitly, because sometimes it's forgotten that people in vulnerable positions who sometimes need to be helped to do things and, told when to go to the bathroom and things like that, simply due to their circumstances, have the same rights as everybody else. And those steps that have to be taken, for example, if they're in a treatment center or things like that for safety or other things, are basically have to be justified and strongly justified, because otherwise they should be free of those things. So, as I said, one of these rights of individuals to be free of undue influence by others. You're always going to be influenced by people, but this is the foundation of the concern for power differentials in ethical codes, because power differentials contain in them the inherent possibility of the violation of a right of an individual by somebody else. Now, FC and RPM advocates are very vocal about supposedly protecting the communication rights of individuals. They even consider people who oppose FC or RPM not to be sincere people who look at the research and say, hey, this thing fails most of the time, but simply to be anti-communication choice, which I have not met an opponent of FC or RPM who is anti-communication choice. I look at people like Howard Shane, who have spent their entire career trying to expand communication choice to more people under more circumstances and do it more effectively. Yet they label them as such. This is pure propaganda. As I said, what that claim is objectively false. It's projection, because it's people who hold a person's hand and don't let them do other things that are opposing communication choice, and of course ironic as well. Let's look at this, and I think this might be the last slide if you're getting impatient and want to go home. In Hahn versus Lynn County, I believe this is the early 2000s, Douglas Bicklin, the guy who brought facilitated communication to the United States, and then fundamentally he could be credited for spreading it to the rest of the world, because he's an excellent writer. I mean, he's a compelling writer and he's prolific and he produced huge amounts of materials, and so does his students. I wish his students weren't into FC because they're good students. But Douglas Bicklin testified that as much as 40% of FC might be invalid. This is in a court case. So he's the FC guy. There's a little thumbnail of the court case. So yet, despite that kind of admission, FC and RPM advocates not only oppose any validity testing at all, sometimes at the systematic level, telling their folks, the people they communicate with, not to participate in studies, they themselves will not incorporate simple and effective protections against influence into their ongoing procedures. There are no blinded probe trials in rapid prompting. There are none recommended. Same thing with facilitated communication. There are no data collected to test to see if there are anomalies. There are no attempts to correlate the stimuli with other cues such that maybe the output isn't due to the communication, but due to something else. None of that. In this book, Facilitated Communication Training by Rosemary Crosley from 1994, there is a heading of one section that says, don't test. Now, why would people advocating a procedure that could be simply validated literally tell you not to test? Well, you know why that is. These facilitated communication advocates and rapid prompting advocates often say that it's insulting to question the FC output, or it's even hate speech, as Anna Stubblefield said in a 2011 article. No, it's not hate speech. It's looking at 400 some failures in the literature and all of these court cases where people were put in solitary confinement, lost their life savings, only to be discovered that the communication wasn't real. Questioning this is the most justified position. It's not hate speech at all. And we're going to find out that it is protective of the person who is supposedly communicating. Remember projection, where we're going to see this. It's not the user who's objecting to being questioned about the validity of the communication. It's the facilitator projecting that onto the user. If we accept, as we have to, I believe, that some sizable fraction of FC isn't real, even if it isn't Douglas Bicklin's fraction, then every FC user's communication choice is at risk of being violated, either ongoing by a bad facilitator or by a good facilitator who may fall under the influence of the Transcendental Temptation. Why then, given the dangers of facilitated communication, the dangers to sincere parents who want to hear their children speak and tell them that they love them and hear the same thing back, why aren't they the loudest voices screaming from the mountains, calling for certainty in this matter, and whether or not that individual child is clearly and unequivocally speaking and not the facilitator, either a bad facilitator altogether or a facilitator who has gone bad? And why are they themselves not installing the most rigorous protections for their clients against unconscious influence, even potentially conscious manipulation? Because you know, out of every 100 facilitators, there's got to be some bad actors. The only way to avoid taking all of these steps is for the advocates of facilitated communication and rapid prompting to literally take the position that there is no bad FC or RPM except every instance of it, regardless of its face validity. The child is looking up in the air while somebody is staring at the keyboard and typing. It's clearly not the child typing. Yet the socially required position in both of these areas seems to be to accept that every instance of facilitated communication is real, regardless of how questionable it is, and do nothing to find out whether it's real to protect the rights of the client against fraud, maleficence, and to assure beneficence. That's the end.
Thank you so much. And that was a wonderful presentation. And I appreciated your immense use of logic, right, to discuss these difficult issues. as anyone can see, it is 10 minutes over our end time. I kind of made the executive decision that we would do that because this has been such a fascinating and very important discussion for families and practitioners as well. But I'm just, even though we're over time, I'm going to do just a few little questions if you don't mind. Dr. Todd, can you comment on claims that ABA is potentially as abusive as facilitated communication?
Oh, I think that's total nonsense. That's again another propaganda point. There are obviously people who do ABA badly, just like there are people who do insight therapy badly, and that there are people who build cars badly. But that's not the point. And it's not true that the ABA of the past was terrible, and we've developed ABA all over since it began was primarily reinforcement based. The people who do ABA are concerned about the person trying to become more able to comport themselves in the environment that they're in, go to the toilet, speak, make change, go to school, play with their friends, all of these things. I've never met these horrible ABA people who these folks are talking about, and some of the ways that ABA has been trained. I'm totally unfamiliar with these things. This idea, for example, that Lovaas founded ABA is nonsensical. I went to graduate school in the 1980s at the biggest behavioral school in the world at the time, and I had zero Lovaas studies to read. He was barely involved. So this is all nonsense. Obviously, you can do bad things with ABA, and the people who write these things seem to sometimes have lack of nuance. For example, if you took a class like mine, I would explain under what conditions repeated positive reinforcement would be stressful, under what conditions the same rate of positive reinforcement would be a really cool thing to have. But that level of understanding is lacking. And I think that it back up and take some education, learn about these things, rather than making these broad strokes and accuse people who are trying to help a child go to the bathroom at the right time, make change, talk to somebody, perhaps react in a more positive way to somebody, in a social situation. Look at that and come back later.
All right. I'm going to ask you one more question, and then what I would like everyone on the panel to do is unmute yourself and also your video, activate your video, and we'll ask people just for quick closing comments. But Dr. Todd, are you saying the fact that okay, I don't totally understand this question, that they use FC to investigate and determine abuse cases is the fault of FC rather than the stupidity of the investigators in their methods of assessment? Really?
I can try to answer that question because I came up with, I had to testify on exactly that issue. I don't think that the parents in most cases, probably in the vast majority of cases, are culpable in this. The professionals who advocate the facilitated communication certainly are. We sometimes, for example, in the Wendrow case, the girl supposedly did algebra and typed sentences the very first time she was touched by the facilitator. That's not credible. The parents who are loving parents interacted with their daughter every day in all kinds of ways would have seen concomitant behavior indicating the possibility of that. But going back to the other part of the question, one of the things that happened in the Wendrow case in the civil part is the lawyer for the prosecutor who was being sued by the Wendrows asked essentially that question. And they said, you are a Ph.D., you understand, they're talking to me, all these issues, and you can see this and you can recognize the problems, whereas other people don't have the education. And I pointed out that everybody at the table that they were sitting at either had a Juris Doctor degree or was a police officer supposedly trained in investigatory techniques and how to sift out the truthful wheat from the misleading chaff. And so in some senses, I might agree with that questioner that everybody needs to take take some responsibility and step back and go, wait a minute, here's a child who for 10, 12, 14, 20 years, and then of course they're not a child at 20, has never done anything to indicate this level of communication prowess. And all of a sudden, a facilitator comes in and it appears from nowhere. They've had speech pathologists and other people. That should be a red flag in itself, even if by some chance it were possible. And so one of the things is we have this sort of magic that facilitated communication and rapid prompting have within them to cause that level of rationality to disappear. Here's this thing that appears that is so unlikely that no one sees it except for this very select group of people. And so in some senses, I guess I agree with the questioner, although I don't quite understand the question.
Yeah. Okay. Understood. Okay. Let's do quick wrap up. Dr. Schlosser, do you want to go first? Just about a minute of closing observations.
Yeah, I haven't really prepared a closing argument of any kind, but just a plea to let's look at the evidence. Let's have the data do the talking. That's what I advocate for. Thank you.
Very good. Dr. Shane?
Well, I think what Ralf just said about let the evidence speak for itself. I feel the same way. What I said about AAC, I stand by, and I think that the important piece of this is the sudden literacy. I think that needs to be really explored. And as I said, and Jim also mentioned, the people who've worked with these individuals for years are generally and usually surprised by the sudden emergence of that kind of literacy. And I also stand by what I said with respect to access, that with all the tools and techniques and strategies and professionals who understand access, I still don't understand why parents aren't demanding the opportunity to be seen, to find out if their children can do this independently. The last thing is, I looking at some of the comments, there was the questions about independence. Ralf mentioned it, but the issue of moving up to complete independence, I haven't seen it and I haven't read about it, and I think that needs to legitimately be shown if we're to believe that a person starts out being facilitated and then ends up being an independent communicator.
Thank you. Janyce?
I guess I would say that I did my experience with FC was exactly backwards. I got into FC, and then after I got out of it, started asking a whole lot of questions. I would encourage people to ask those questions ahead of time before making a commitment to FC and RPM. If you've decided already that FC is going to work for you and your child, or RPM is going to work for you and your child, it's really a big psychological ask to back off from that position. So with all the evidence that's out there, I would suggest doing it the other way. Don't make up your mind. Ask a lot of questions first.
Thank you. Finally, if you have one more thing to say, Dr. Todd, please go chime in.
No, I agree with all of the commenters, including about the folks who are supposedly independent communicators as a result of these things. We don't have scientific evidence of that, and it should be easy to claim. But as I said, my concern is not with the parents and people who are trying to just get the best out of life and help their children do the things that every parent wants for their children, but the professionals who need to do a better job and look at the scientific evidence. And even if they don't like the scientific evidence, if you believe it works, do the giant study that shows that it works most of the time, rather than sit here and argue against the hundreds and hundreds of instances where this thing has failed.
All right. Well, thank you. We're about 18 minutes over our time. So thank you so much for your time and for the wonderful presentations, extremely thoughtful. Also, thank you to the attendees for the great questions. We are recording this and we will post it on our website, ncsautism.org, shortly, within the next day or two, most likely. Okay. With that, I bid everybody farewell. And again, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.